everyone. Welcome. Actually, you might want to move this around a little bit. So, hi, everybody. Welcome to Thursday. Thursday is only one day away from Friday, which is yet another day away from Saturday, which is even better. So yeah, go Thursday. Today, I am going to be launching sort of full speed into Photoshop. And I have a couple of, I guess, introductory remarks about, shifting gears from a sort of traditional lecture mode into something where we're actually doing something or making something. I'm really curious also if y'all have any questions that you would like to ask me. No? Okay, hi.
So you said you've been doing like web design and this kind of stuff for a long time. So you always work with Photoshop, or do you do it like different kind of thing?
That's a great question. The answer is yes. I always did work with Photoshop. Photoshop has been around since 1988, which is before I was old enough to really care. And so, yeah, Photoshop has really been like the de facto standard for digital image manipulation for a really, really long time. So I started using Photoshop back in version 2. Old is what it is. So yeah, another sort of maybe somewhat related point, a lot of people maybe are not super happy about having to pay their subscription fee to Adobe. I certainly empathize with you. Obviously, being in academia, like the university kind of takes care of that for me. But back when I was working independently, it was a pretty bitter pill to swallow. So there is an open source alternative to Photoshop. It's called the GNU Image Manipulation Program, which that acronym is the GIMP. So that program is completely serviceable. It doesn't have a lot of the kind of advanced features that people expect out of Photoshop, but if you're looking for something to do a kind of maybe more bare bones version of Photoshop, it's completely reasonable, and I used it for many years. And nobody, when they look at your image, is going to know whether you created it in Photoshop or whether you created it in GIMP. So I personally, if I were not having the university buy me a subscription of Adobe, I probably would still be using the GIMP. Okay. Any other questions? I had one question over email, which was really remarkable and wonderful. It was the question of, hey, Meg, why haven't you published the lecture from Tuesday yet? So I totally did it on Tuesday afternoon, and then I forgot to hit the little green button. So please, send me those messages, and usually within like an hour, I can, hit the green button. So thanks for that. Okay, so as I said, we're kind of moving into Photoshop. We have a Photoshop assignment called the Throwback Collage. If y'all have any questions about the assignment, I think we can talk about it briefly here in class, but you can email me or email your TAs. And then we're going to be working through 3 demonstrations of Photoshop, and then we'll still be working in Photoshop in week 5, but we're going to move to a time-based format of working with Photoshop. So we'll just be doing some different stuff. So these two, for the next 2.5 weeks, we'll pretty much be working with image manipulation. So if we go to the Throwback Collage assignment, some people get a tiny bit tripped up on the theme of the assignment. And I guess I would say, before you have like a brain aneurysm trying to think about what might be retro or what qualifies as retro style, I would maybe just short circuit that process and say, whatever it means to you. So obviously what retro means to me as an, well, I'll say as a 40-something person, is maybe a little bit different than what it means to you. So that's kind of fine. If retro means to you something that you did 5 years ago, okay, go for it. Just embrace that style, whatever that style means to you, basically. So I wouldn't get super tripped up on that. I think that when the TAs look at your work, Tony, we're going to be kind of like allowing an open interpretation of the theme. The point of us giving themes to you in assignments is actually to like help you rather than to sort of limit you. So don't interpret themes as limits, interpret them as maybe more like prompts for you to start with. I hope that's helpful. So yeah, basically what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be making a version of one of these full color compositions in lecture, and then I'll probably show you at some point on probably the third Photoshop lecture, I'll show you a little bit of how you could make variations, because I do want everyone just to note that we're asking for two full color compositions done in Photoshop. So another question that I get a lot about this assignment is like, can one be a variation of the first? Can the second be a variation of the first? Yes. Can the second be completely different from the first? Yes. You can handle that however you want. Although in class, I'm going to be demonstrating how to generate variations. Okay. So yeah, so we're going to do pretty much all this stuff in lecture. So without further ado, I think I am going to crack open Photoshop. Maybe before I crack open Photoshop, I will give you sort of a sneak peek of the images that I've selected for today. I just have these sort of project folders for myself. So I just gave myself like, because you all are dealing with kind of potentially random images from the interwebs, I sort of gave myself a selection of very different images from different sources. So I'm just going to go through them super quickly. And if you hang on just one second. Also, something that might come into kind of visibility within this class, and I don't usually talk about personal stuff, but it's something that might affect my teaching a little bit. I really need to get glasses, and I have had a medical appointment set up for like 8 months with an optometrist. It's in a couple of weeks. So for the next couple of weeks, if I kind of hesitate and like look at the screen for a really long time, that's why. It's because I can't see. So I did just want to mention that in case you're like looking at me like, what's going on? Okay, so yeah, I have, here's sort of like my smattering of random images. So I have this image of a fern leaf. This is an image that I took with my Canon 5D Mark III. So it's a very, as you can see, it's a very high quality, you know, lots of pixels, very sharp. This is an image that I got off the internet. So this is an image of some jellyfish. This is another image that I kind of harvested from the New York Public Library's Digital Image Archive. So this is actually a photograph of a print of a fern. So this is a book series from the 1800s where some guy basically inked up ferns, put ink on them, and then splooshed them on a piece of paper. And they make these really beautiful prints. And so these are this is a fairly high resolution image. I would say it's probably in the 4,000 to 5,000 pixel range. And there's lots of detail, lots of room to maneuver in a high resolution image. If we wanted to maybe just crop out this area, we could do that and probably still have a fairly high quality result. This is an image that I made with a desktop scanner. So a desktop scanner is probably one of the somewhat anachronistic, like they're a little bit hard to find these days, but you still see them in archiving and preservation contexts, particularly with libraries. So any of the major libraries on campus should have a desktop scanner. I know that the art library does have one. And you can scan pretty much anything. I don't know if anyone has ever played with a Xerox machine, you know, the thing that makes copies in like an office situation. I think there was an episode of The Office once where they all got really drunk and like sat on the Xerox machine. You can totally do that with a desktop scanner. So the desktop scanner is basically just a flat camera. So anything that you put in front of it will get recorded. And people do all kinds of weird stuff with desktop scanners. This was really just a sort of, as you can see, it's an object and not an image. And then there's another object. Because it's a desktop scanner, you can see some of the sort of artifacts of the process. Like this is the light that gets shown on the object, basically, from the scanner as it does its thing. So using a scanner is an option. It's just not an option that you would see a lot in super contemporary contexts. Like, I probably gave up on having a desktop scanner in my studio more than a decade ago. And the reason is because digital cameras got to the point where you could just photograph something. You know, if you wanted to photograph a piece of paper or a document or something, you can obviously just do that with your digital camera. So then here's another internet image of some jellyfish. This is an image, I'll show you the video. This is an image of a body of work that I'm working on. Oh, hey, I got the same thing. If we see any children, we should call the police. Anyway, this image is actually a still frame from a 3D rendered video that I made. And I think I showed you all that like ice cave that I was working on. Well, one of the things that I want to do in the ice caves is have these like beanbag chill out areas where you can just like sit on the ice and like watch videos of cats. For real. That's my plan. So this is a still frame, but this is a really kind of like perfect image for what we're doing right now, and I'll tell you why when we get to work on it. So this is a straight up photograph of, digital photograph of a greenhouse in England. And again, this image has some parts of it that may be interesting, but the overall image probably is not that interesting. Looks like I also have a digital screenshot in here, which again is totally an option. If you take a high resolution screenshot, it's a high resolution image, no different from an image that comes from a camera. It just, you know, it's not a photograph. And then of course I have what we worked on Tuesday, which is this vulture in flight. So basically with these, I'm gonna be able to create a sort of series of collages that use the images in different ways. So I'm going to start up Photoshop from scratch just to make sure that we get the full experience. You may also notice that these photos are all different formats. That's pretty typical when you're looking for images on the internet or from a variety of sources. They'll come in a variety of file formats. In general, I don't think there's anything wrong with any of these three file formats, and these are the most common that you'll encounter. So the TIFF is sort of a high-quality option for high-quality uncompressed digital images. So we'll talk about these formats at length. JPEG, again, usually pretty good, but you can have a JPEG that is really terrible if it's over-compressed. But for the most part, it should be fine. And then we also, it looks like we have a PNG, which is another file format. It's actually an uncompressed format. So PNG tends to be a little more high quality than JPEG. The problem with PNG, and I think that this is a problem that hopefully is dead, PNG is a newer file format, and until recently, there were some browsers and software programs that didn't support it. So, you know. All right, so when you open up Photoshop, you get this sort of quick start screen. And before I kind of jump into all the Photoshop stuff, I also forgot, I had a super great question from somebody in the audience before class. And that was basically like, what am I supposed to do while you're talking about all this Photoshop stuff, basically? Like, should I take notes? Should I like pay attention? What, you know, should I try to follow along with you? I guess basically I would do whatever feels comfortable for you. I do think that sometimes even just jotting down incomprehensible notes can be helpful for your own memory and understanding. I mean, I have found that useful for myself. I think that trying to follow along step by step during the in-person lecture probably might be a little frustrating because we kind of just go at it. One of the reasons why I'm making the recordings available to you is so that if, when you're actually making your own work, you have a question about something that I did in lecture, you can go back to it and you can pause it and then you can try it and then you can pause it and then you can try it. And so probably, doing some combination of like trying your best to pay attention in class, maybe jotting down notes or following along as you feel is, appropriate, but knowing that you don't have to, right? That there's that recording that's there to kind of back you up as far as like, figuring out how to do things when you're actually working on your own assignment. So that's my personal opinion on that. Okay, so we're back at Photoshop. I'm probably the only person you'll ever meet that takes like half an hour to start Photoshop. So we're going to go to make a new file. And when you go to the new document thing, yours might look slightly different from mine. So I've done this demo before, so I have a recent sort of thing for a document that's 8.5 by 11 at 300 ppi. You probably don't have this. So what you would want to do is go to the Print tab, because we are designing something that could potentially be printed at a very high resolution at 8.5 by 11. And you would select this letter preset. Now, I would just immediately go over here to the preset details, and you'll notice that it's in inches. When you're working in print, it is common to have your image specified in terms of inches and not pixels, as we were doing, on Tuesday. So why is your image specified in inches when you're making prints? I'll tell you the answer is super simple. It's because paper comes in inches. If you're in Europe, it comes in metric, okay? So basically that paper is like a measured thing and it goes through the paper. It's a physical object. So you're gonna be using sort of instruments of physical measurement when you're working in print. There is also this issue of orientation. One thing that I really, really want people to kind of like make an effort to work on is to not make every single one of your compositions portrait orientation. That's the default. Who wants the default? The default's boring. So try to kind of mix it up a little and don't be afraid to click on that landscape thing. Can you change it later? Oh, totally. We'll definitely do that. But yeah, just don't always sort of assume that you have to use the default. And then here under color mode, these are things that, if you continue along with Photoshop, you may find yourself wanting to use other settings like 16-bit or 32-bit. For now, I think that 8-bit is totally sufficient. And then also, probably most importantly, the resolution. You can see in the assignment prompt that it asks pretty clearly for 8.5 by 11 at 300 ppi in RGB color mode. And so what we are basically asking you to do is to use this preset, but also, just know that this image or this number is directly sort of corresponding to the actual resolution. So if we wanted to, just as kind of a brain exercise, if we wanted to think about how many pixels is in this 8.5 by 11 image at 300 ppi. I'm not going to do it for you, but I kind of just want to make sure y'all get this. So that's going to be 8 inches times 300, and then 11 times 300. So when it's saying 300 pixels per inch, it really means it. And that's basically how you would find the pixel size. Are there much easier ways of finding the pixel size of your image? Oh yeah, you don't have to do math, but sometimes to just like see the math, it's a little bit helpful. Okay, so I think we're pretty much ready to go. We're kind of rolling with the default here, except I shifted it into landscape format, so it wouldn't be quite so predictable. And now what we get is this kind of generic white canvas. I'm going to go ahead and make my window a little bit larger. There's some kind of boring setup stuff that I want to make sure that we get out of the way. I would say in general, with all of these technical demos, which demo in the series is the most important? Without question, it is the first one. Because in the first one, I'm basically showing you how to set up your environment so that all of the other tutorials make sense. So if for some reason, let's say I'm going to go to a different workspace configuration, so I'll go to this workspace configuration. If I came in and my environment was set up like this, and I tried to watch a video where I was showing you how to do something, and this has happened before, I've gotten screenshots from students that are like, my Photoshop looks nothing like your Photoshop. What gives? And so basically, I'm just going to draw attention to the fact right now that I'm sort of like declaring a workspace. So if you do this step of declaring this workspace, your Photoshop setup should be fairly identical to mine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Window and then Workspace, and I'm just going to use the Essentials default workspace. So basically what a workspace is it's a collection of little palettes and windows that are sort of geared to the application that you might be using Photoshop for. So as we've said, there's many different sort of reasons why you might use Photoshop. You might use it in a time-based way. You might use it for web design, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all sort of like different workspaces in Photoshop. So we're using Essentials default. And even from there, I probably will bring up additional palettes. So at some point, eventually, I will bring up the Layers palette. And then I can just sort of drag that onto the sort of set of docking windows that I have set up. And you can kind of drag these around and mess with them as you like. I actually prefer, usually when I'm working with certain palettes, I prefer to actually have them floating freely. But that's completely up to you. You can kind of park them if you want. So I'm going to go ahead and close my Layers palette for now. Pretty much anything that shows up on the side of the window in Photoshop, you should be able to get to it from this Window menu. And these are literally like all of the palettes that you could potentially use. So we'll probably use, I don't know, maybe about half of these throughout the next 4 weeks. But a lot of times I'll get short sort of questions from students. It's a super common question to ask. My Layers palette disappeared. How do I get my Layers palette back? And the answer is basically to just come here to the Window menu and reactivate it. Okay? All right, so the first thing I'm going to do before I move any further is I'm going to benefit from all of this experience that I've earned in digital media, and I'm going to save my file so it doesn't get lost. If you have a Creative Cloud account, then by all means, save your file on Creative Cloud. It makes absolutely no difference to me. I prefer to save files on my computer for a couple of reasons. If you're using Creative Cloud or any kind of networked drive as your storage, it can slow things down if your network connection gets a little slow. So usually what I prefer to do is to save things onto my computer and then transport them to the network drive after the fact. So when you're kind of saving things to the network in real time, it can be problematic if your file is really large and maybe your network connection is not very fast. Then it'll basically leave you hanging, literally. Okay, so I'm going to go to this sort of folder that we have set up for doing this. And that should be in here. And right now, it looks like my save dialog is set up for PNG. I actually, in this case, I would like to use the Photoshop document format. So it does say in the assignment prompt that you're supposed to turn in JPEG files. Just to be super clear, that JPEG file is something that you create at the end of your process. If you save a file as a JPEG and you save it repeatedly as a JPEG, all of that JPEG compression kind of compounds, and it just gets more and more terrible as you go along. So for that reason, we're going to use an uncompressed format to save our files. For this, we're using PSD just because it's there. PSD is the native file format of Photoshop, so anything that you do in Photoshop, including really crazy effects, will be preserved and saved, which is awesome. There's another file format that you can also work, probably like 95% of Photoshop's functionality you can capture in a TIFF. So what is the benefit of using Photoshop versus a TIFF? Well, pretty much the only difference that I can tell over the years is that if you have a TIFF file, you can open it in applications other than Photoshop. If you use the Photoshop format, it's going to limit you to the Adobe verse. So it really just depends on how committed you are to Adobe-ness. But in this case, we have the subscription, so I think it's fine to use Photoshop. As of a few years ago, Mac OS's preview will work pretty nicely with Photoshop documents as well. So that's nice. All right, so I'm just going to save it as collage.psd. And now what I'm going to do, I basically have this empty file. It has a white background on it, as you can see. I think probably I would begin just by getting another image in here. And so there are so many different ways that you can import images into Photoshop. Probably the easiest way is to just take the image. I'll take these cats, for example. And you can just drag it in there. That was interesting. So now I'm going to bring up my layers palette, and you can see that here in the layers palette now, I have a background layer, and then I have kitty with a frame number. So basically what that means is that I have successfully imported this file. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things about this thing that I just dragged in here. Well, one thing is that it appears to have a bounding box around it. So anytime you see this sort of box with the sort of handles on the side, those are handles with which you can scale the image in interesting ways. You can also rotate the image. Don't worry if you don't want to do any of that stuff yet, because you can always come back and do it later. Right now, I'm just hitting Control-Z to kind of backpedal on those last two things that I did. So another super typical sort of beginning Photoshop brain freeze thing is that I'll have a student that comes in, they bring their image in, just like I did, and they might say to me, yeah, like, it's great, but I can't do anything to it. Look, if I go to the paintbrush, it's like, what? I basically get some smack from Photoshop anytime I try to do anything to it. So I'm going to go back one step and bring that image in again, and I'm going to show you sort of like the final step. So when you bring the image in, you get your bounding box. You'll see this no symbol and this check symbol. This no and check thing appears many, many times in Photoshop in different circumstances. Basically, you want to hit the check symbol, which is like a way of finalizing it. And now you can see the bounding box disappears. And now we're in a place where we can do pretty much whatever we want to this image. So it's like, it's in for real now. When it comes in and you can still see the checkbox, it's like there visually, but it's not really there. So it's kind of one of those just annoying things that you have to deal with in Photoshop. So always pretty much hit the checkbox. In general, I get that question like a ton. And I do it myself, I just don't notice it. So if something's going wrong in Photoshop or you're not able to use tools in Photoshop, probably the first thing to check would be if there is a little checkbox here. Yeah.
Can you move the kitty image after you press the checkbox, or is it just like a final, like you can't touch this?
No, it's not finalizing it like it's finalizing the import action, basically. So yeah, it's basically like allowing it to work like any other Photoshop layer when you hit that check. So I can actually make the check come up again. So there's a transform object. So if I go to the set of tools over here, this is called the your sort of introductory set of tools, or the large tool set. If you go to the move tool, which pretty much the move tool is like my default tool in Photoshop. Like if I'm just kind of messing around, trying to maybe move stuff, interfacing with the palettes, the move tool is a good sort of tool to not do too much damage. And it can, move things around, literally. So if I get the move tool, I can grab this and move it around. If I want the bounding box to come back, I can actually click this for Show Transform Controls. And then I can adjust the file. Now, you notice when I just transformed it again, I have my checkbox back, right? So here, I basically would just click the checkbox to confirm that transformation. So it's a thing that pops up pretty much anytime you try to make significant changes to the position or rotation of any object in Photoshop. So it's just, yeah, it's a big part of the sort of how Photoshop works, and it trips people up. So now that I have this maybe scaled down a tiny bit, one of the things that I want to do, especially if we're going to start collaging, is I'd like to get at least one more image in here. And then I would also like to potentially think about ways that those images can layer together. So one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to just drag another image in here. I think I'm going to go for one of these jellyfish images. Now you can see that this image imported in a way that both of these images actually imported in a way where they were not the full size of the 8.5 by 11 300 DPI environment. The reason for that is because they're not that big. So unless you tell it otherwise, Photoshop is going to import the images at actual size. So this image, for example, it's a video still, so it's probably about 1080 by 1920 pixels. This is even smaller. Does that mean that we're stuck at this size? Absolutely not. I could make this image a little bit bigger. This image in particular, because it doesn't have any real sharp detail, and it's got kind of a lot of like graceful, maybe blending and tones and things, this would be an image that actually would scale up pretty gracefully because it doesn't have a lot of areas that are visually going to let us know that it's not right? Because it's kind of a little bit abstract. So I can scale this up, 50%, and it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Here, you can see that I can stack the layers in the layer palette. So one of these is on top of the other now, and vice versa, right? So I think I'm going to put the kitties on top right now, and I'm just going to do, in our sort of last 10 minutes here, I'm going to make it so that the kitties are sort of maybe liberated from this like sickly pink background. So now that might actually be a little tricky. The reason that it might be a little tricky, if we zoom in on the cats, is that over here, you can see we have a super clear definition of what is cat and what is background. In general, having that super clear definition of what is background and what is not, and that is through brightness and color, is like the key to making really great selections in Photoshop. When you get into situations over here where you've got a much less clear difference between background and cat, and we start to use the selection tools in Photoshop, we might just have to do a little bit more work, basically, to get it to turn out correctly. Because Photoshop is I'm sure that they're marketing all kinds of AI tools, and they do some things really well, and tools have a lot more intelligence than they used to, but they're still pretty dumb. So pretty much selection tools in Photoshop work based on brightness and color. And so when you have issues of areas of an image where there's similar color, it just gets to be a little tricky. So let's go ahead and try to select the pink color. When I'm selecting things out of the background or the foreground, I basically choose whether I want to select the background or the foreground based on what has the most complexity. So in this case, I think we can say super clearly that the background has much less complexity than the foreground, right? The kitties have all kinds of tones and stuff happening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the background because why? Because it's easy. So I'm going to come in here and just use my magic wand tool. So that was right up here. And I'm going to go ahead and select that pink area. Now, you may notice a couple of things. You may notice that we selected all of the pink that is touching the area that I selected, and it kind of left out the area down here. So there's a couple of ways that you can get around that. One way is to use the Shift key, and then it puts you into what's called additive selection mode. So you may have noticed up here this box on box, or box with box, sort of trying to visually let you know that you're basically adding to the selection. So if you hit the Shift key, that box will actually activate, as you can see right there. Boy, is everyone okay? Wow. So yeah, I could hit the Shift key and I could add in all of these little areas. This is starting to resemble work. Maybe let's not. That seems like a lot of work. So there's an easier way to do that, and that is to go up here to the Select menu. And if you go to the Select menu, you can actually select Similar. And what that's going to do is it's going to select similarly colored or similarly bright pixels. So if I just hit Similar, it'll kind of globally do the whole thing for me all at once, which is really nice. Of course, there are reasons why you would want to sort of select these areas by hand, right? But in this case, we just want everything. So yeah, that's fantastic. So now, probably before I go any further, I would just go in here and maybe take a look at the selection that I just made. It looks like it's leaving behind a little bit of the pink background. And I'm just going to show you what that looks like. So I'll kind of move to the next step quickly, but don't worry, I'll do it again. So if I make a layer mask and hide the selection, you can see here that it has this kind of pink halo around it. I don't know. Some people might think that looks really cool, but let's just pretend that we want to get rid of it, maybe. So you've got this pink halo over your entire selection. This is basically like sort of selection 101, like how to finesse the boundary between background and foreground. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit the back button a couple times. So I'm going to go back to the very beginning of my selection. There is a better way to step back through history steps, but we're kind of not quite there yet. So I've got this. Now I just selected it once. It doesn't have the non-contiguous or the areas that aren't sort of directly next to the pink, so I want to do that select similar thing again. And if I want to go into this sort of knowing that I don't want that sort of pink border around my cats, I can definitely come in here and basically I can change the placement of that edge. So there's a whole sort of set of tools for doing that. It's called the under select menu. It's called modify. And in this case, I want to expand the selection because we're selecting the pink stuff, so we want the pink selection to get bigger and to eat into this area right here. So if you're not sure if you want to expand or contract, I'll give you a hint. You have a 50% chance of being right. So try one, and if it doesn't work, try the other one. Particularly with selections, because they're sort of binary, they're kind of, on one side or on the other side, it can be a little confusing, so don't worry about that. Okay, so if I want to expand the selection, I'm gonna just go ahead and expand it by 3 pixels, which I guess based on, my visual sort of inspection, it's definitely not 10, it's a couple pixels basically, so I decided to do 3. And you can see now that selection is much, much tighter. Did I overdo it a tiny bit? Maybe. Part of one of the things that you have to kind of understand about selections in Photoshop is that in Photoshop in general, if you're looking at your image like this, and you're saying to yourself, man, that looks like crap. That's awful. And I'm like, well, yeah, it doesn't look that great, right? It's, a pixel, we're seeing kind of the pixels break down and that kind of stuff. I would maybe just remind you that this is nowhere near the viewing or print resolution of your image. It's way, way in. So if you want to actually see what your image is going to look like on the thing that you're doing, you can do this print size preview. And you can see here in the print size preview, you're like, oh yeah, those 2 pixels don't matter a bit. So definitely thinking a little bit about scale and what the viewing scale is going to be of the image can be really helpful, because one of the problems that I have personally in Photoshop is that I'm very detail oriented, and I tend to just like go in as far as I can, and then when I come back out, I'm like, oh, I might have just wasted an entire day like fixing that. So in any case, now we have the selection sort of refined. It's kind of where we want, and we can go back into the layer menu and make a layer mask. So once again, with layer masks, similar to the selection tools, there's a reveal selection or hide selection. In this case, because I'm pretty sure we selected the pink stuff, we want to actually hide the selection, right? You have a 50-50 chance of being right. So if you get it wrong, it takes you not even 10 seconds to go back and try the other method. So here's my sort of now sort of knocked out cats. And you can see now that they're in a much better place as far as the edges. So we're not getting that kind of gross edge on them anymore. Last thing I want to finish with, both of these images, because they were dragged in from the desktop, both of these images have these little icons next to them. I want to show you what happens when I just open an image from Photoshop. So if I take maybe one of those images from my stack, let's just do the cats again for purposes of comparison. If I take this background layer and I hover it from Photoshop over to the thing, you can see that it imports it, but it imports it in a slightly different way, right? Is it bad? Is it good? I don't know. I mean, it's fine. It's just different. What's different about it? Well, right now, what you basically get when you import things directly from Photoshop is you get a fully rasterized layer. So you can see these 2 little icons here indicating that these layers are not supposedly rasterized. Is it a trivial problem to rasterize an image? It's totally easy, and it's not a big deal. So you can come over here to this layer, and you can go to Layer, Rasterize, Layer, Rasterize Layer. And now this layer is just like the other layer, except it's a slightly different size and it has a layer mask on it. Why does it matter whether an image is rasterized or not? It kind of doesn't. There are a few Photoshop effects that will not work on layers that are not rasterized. So that's the only reason why I'm mentioning it. But for the most part, it shouldn't give you any problems. So I think this is a good place to stop for today. We're going to sort of, as I said, in the next couple of sessions, we're going to really kind of get into Photoshop with both feet. So don't forget to have an awesome weekend.